She was with my stepdad, behind my back.
I came home 2 hours early that night. Just 2 hours. That's all it took to hear my wife's voice. Soft, breathless, saying a name I never expected to hear from her lips again. The same name my mother used to say with that same tone, years ago, on late night phone calls. It was him, my mother's partner, in our bedroom, with her. I didn't move. I stood just inside the front door, keys clenched so tightly in my hand that the metal pressed into my skin. The house felt wrong in a way I didn't have words for yet. Not loud, not chaotic, just occupied, claimed, like I'd stepped into a version of my life that had been continuing without me for some time. I didn't go upstairs. I didn't need to. The realization landed all at once, heavy and complete, rearranging memories faster than I could slow them down. Holidays, dinners, the way he always knew where everything was in our house, the way my wife never seemed uncomfortable around him, only calmer, too calm. I stepped back outside and closed the door quietly, careful not to let it click. The night air hit me hard, colder than it should have been. I stood there staring at the dark reflection of myself in the window, trying to understand how a life could fracture without a single dramatic moment, how something could feel inevitable only after it was already happening. What hurt wasn't shock. It was recognition, because this hadn't started tonight. It had started long before, in pieces small enough to ignore. I leaned against the porch railing and tried to breathe normally while my mind replayed the past year with new clarity. The way my wife had insisted we spend more time with my mother, how she'd encouraged dinners, weekends, casual drop-ins, how she always volunteered to help clean up when he was still there, how conversation shifted subtly when I entered the room, like I'd interrupted something mid-thought. I told myself it was family closeness. I told myself it was harmless. My mother had been with him for nearly 15 years, long enough that no one questioned his presence. He wasn't my father. He hadn't raised me. He came into our lives when I was already grown, already married. He was just there, consistent, familiar, embedded, and now I understood what that familiarity had become. The night stretched on while I stood outside, unable to decide whether going back in would change anything. Eventually, the house went quiet. Lights upstairs turned off. Silence settled in, thick and deliberate. I went back inside then. The stairs creaked beneath my feet in a way they never had before. Every sound suddenly loud. I stopped halfway up, listening. Nothing. Just the hum of the house, returning to normal, like it always did after pretending nothing had happened. I slept in the guest room, not because I made a decision, because my body couldn't move toward the bedroom without feeling like I was trespassing. In the morning, my wife acted like everything was normal. She made coffee, asked about my schedule, kissed my cheek the way she always did, quick, automatic, practiced. Her voice was steady. Her hands didn't shake. She didn't avoid my eyes. That scared me more than guilt would have. He wasn't there. But the evidence of him was everywhere if you knew how to look for it. A glass in the sink that wasn't ours. The faint scent of his cologne mixed with our laundry soap. The guest towel missing from the bathroom downstairs. She noticed me noticing. "Everything okay?" she asked casually. "Yes," I said. It was the first lie I told out loud. That day, I went to work and did nothing. I stared at my screen while my thoughts circled one unbearable question. How long? Not if, how long, because no one gets comfortable enough to be in someone else's bedroom without practice. That night, my mother called. Her voice was cheerful, familiar. She talked about plans, about something he'd fixed around the house, about how lucky she felt. I listened quietly, my chest tight, realizing I was hearing a story that no longer belonged to me. I hung up and sat in my car long after I got home. I understood then that I wasn't standing at the beginning of a betrayal. I was standing at the moment I could no longer pretend I didn't see it. And whatever came next, confrontation, silence, collapse, would change more than just my marriage. it would change the shape of my family forever. The second day after I came home early, I started noticing how carefully my life had been managed. Not in dramatic ways, no sudden disappearances, no strange perfume, no obvious signs that would make a story neat and easy to explain. It was worse than that. It was subtle, domestic, the kind of details you only recognize once your trust has already been cracked. My wife began predicting my movements the way a seasoned traveler predicts weather. If I said I'd be home late, she didn't ask why. If I said I'd be home early, she didn't look relieved. She simply adjusted, too smoothly, too quickly, like she'd already planned for both outcomes. That week, my mother invited us over for dinner. She'd been doing that more often lately. I'd told myself it was a good thing. Family, connection, stability. Now I couldn't stop wondering whose idea it had been. My mother's, my wife's, or his. When I mentioned the invitation to my wife, she smiled immediately. "Of course," she said, "we should go." Her enthusiasm made my stomach tighten. I watched her pour coffee, the way her hand didn't shake, the way she didn't pause as if she had to calculate anything. That calm was its own kind of answer. At work, I did the same thing I'd done the day before. I showed up physically and disappeared mentally. Every conversation felt like it was happening through glass. I found myself replaying sounds more than images. Her voice, his name, the softness in her tone. It stayed with me like a song you can't stop hearing once it starts. That night at my mother's house, everything looked normal. The table set neatly, the smell of food, my mother laughing too loudly at her own jokes, and him standing by the sink, drying his hands with the towel like he belonged there, asking me about my job in a warm, casual way. "Good to see you," he said. I nodded. "Yeah, you too." My wife greeted him like she always had, polite, friendly, but I caught something new in the way she stood too close for a moment, as if her body moved before her mind could remember the rules. He looked at her, just briefly. Nothing anyone else would notice. No touching. No obvious exchange. But there was a familiarity in his eyes that felt like a private room I wasn't allowed into. During dinner, I watched them the way you watch a stage play once you've learned the ending. My mother talked and talked, oblivious, happy in a way that made me feel sick. My wife asked him questions, small ones, practical ones, about a repair he'd done, about the garden, about whether he'd gotten enough sleep. She didn't ask my mother those questions. She asked him. When my mother left the table to grab dessert, my wife stood immediately. "I'll help," she said. He stood too. "I'll give you a hand," he offered. My mother called from the kitchen. "Oh, you don't have to." They were already gone. I stayed seated, staring at my plate, listening to footsteps move down the hall. I told myself not to do it, not to follow, not to turn myself into a man who sneaks around corners and hunts for proof. Then I heard it. Not laughter this time. A quiet murmur. Her voice, low and close. His voice answering in the same tone. The kind of conversation that doesn't belong in a busy kitchen during a family dinner. My hands went cold. I stood and walked toward the kitchen, keeping my pace even. When I entered, they were on opposite sides of the counter, both holding plates, both smiling too quickly. My mother was at the oven, unaware. "There you are," my wife saw me and said, "Too bright. We're just getting this ready." He didn't look surprised to see me. That was the part that landed hardest. He looked prepared. Back home later, my wife climbed into bed beside me like nothing had happened. She asked if I wanted to take the kids somewhere over the weekend. She rested her hand on my chest, light and familiar, as if she could smooth the air between us back into place. I stared into the dark and realized something ugly. She thought I was still the man who would accept what I was given. The next morning, I found myself watching her phone, the way people watch a door they don't trust. She wasn't careless, but she wasn't panicked either. She didn't guard it like a secret. She simply kept it close, face down, more often than before. A message came in while she was in the shower. The screen lit up. I didn't touch it. I didn't pick it up. I didn't need to. The preview was enough. a name saved as a single initial, and a line that turned my stomach. Last night shouldn't have happened like that. I stood there frozen, the phone still on the counter like it had weight. The sound of the shower ran steadily, ordinary and indifferent. When she came out, she saw my face before I said anything. "What's wrong?" she asked, towel wrapped around her hair, eyes sharp. "Nothing," I replied. Second lie. The day moved on in a blur. I went through motions with the kids, answered questions at work, smiled when I was expected to, but inside, something had shifted from shock into focus. That message didn't sound like a man who feared consequences. It sounded like a man trying to manage a situation. And my wife was letting him. That evening, my mother called again. She chatted about dinner, about how good it was to see us, about how she wanted us to come by more often because he likes having people around. She said his name with warmth, like she was proud to say it. I listened, my throat tight. Then she said something that made my skin prickle. "He's been so helpful lately," she added. "Always running errands, always out and about. Sometimes I don't even know where he goes, but he says it's just little things for the family." Little things for the family. I thanked her, ended the call, and sat in the quiet of my car for a long time, staring at the steering wheel as if it could tell me what to do. Because now the betrayal had a shape. It wasn't just my wife. It wasn't just him. It was the way the entire situation could exist right under my mother's nose, wrapped in routine, disguised as family togetherness. And I knew, with a certainty that made my stomach hollow, that if I didn't force the truth into the open soon, it would keep growing, quietly, until there was nothing left to save. That night, as my wife slept, her phone buzzed again on the nightstand. I didn't reach for it. I didn't need to, because the name on the screen wasn't an initial this time. It was his full name, and the message preview was only 3 words. "Are you alone?" I didn't answer the message. I didn't pick up the phone. I didn't even turn it over. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to my wife's breathing, even out beside me, trying to understand how a life can split without anyone noticing the seam. "Are you alone?" 3 words, not rushed, not panicked. Familiar? Comfortable. The kind of message you send when you already know the answer, when you've asked it before and received it more than once. That was when I stopped telling myself this was recent. The next few days moved with a strange precision. Like everyone else already knew the choreography, and I was the only one learning the steps. My wife adjusted her schedule with ease. Errands ran long. Visits to my mother became more frequent, framed as kindness, concern, family responsibility. I watched her prepare for those visits the way someone prepares for something important, checking her appearance, choosing words before she spoke them, making sure nothing felt improvised. At my mother's house, he was always there, sometimes working on something, sometimes just sitting, listening, present in a way that felt deliberate now. I started noticing how he positioned himself, never between my wife and my mother, always just off to the side, close enough to engage, far enough to avoid suspicion. He spoke to my mother with patience, affection. He spoke to my wife with something quieter, measured, like he knew exactly how much attention was safe, and to me he was perfectly normal. That was the part that tested me the most. He didn't avoid my eyes, he didn't overcompensate. He asked about my job. He remembered small details. He acted like a man with nothing to hide because he believed, correctly, that I wouldn't say anything. Not yet. One afternoon, my wife told me she was going to help my mother with paperwork, bills, insurance, things my mother always found overwhelming. I nodded, watched her leave, then waited 10 minutes before getting in my car. I didn't follow them to my mother's house. I followed them to a small cafe on the edge of town. I parked across the street, far enough back that I didn't feel ridiculous, close enough that I could see through the window. I told myself I was just confirming something I already knew, that seeing it would somehow make it easier to carry. They arrived separately. He was already there when she walked in, standing, waiting. He smiled when he saw her. Not broadly, not dramatically, just enough. She relaxed the moment she spotted him, her shoulders lowering like she'd set something down. They sat close, not touching, not obviously intimate, but their bodies angled toward each other in a way that excluded the rest of the room. She leaned in when she spoke. He listened like her words mattered more than anyone else's. At one point she laughed. That laugh again. Not loud, not performative, private, familiar. I looked away first. I drove home with my hands steady on the wheel, surprised by how calm I felt. The shock had burned off, leaving behind something colder and more useful. Understanding. I didn't need proof anymore. I needed timing. That night my mother called. She sounded tired, older than usual. She talked about errands, about how grateful she was for my wife's help, about how lucky she felt to have someone who understood how much he does for all of us. I listened, jaw tight, realizing how carefully the truth had been layered around her, how everyone had made decisions on her behalf without her ever knowing she'd been excluded. When I hung up, my wife was watching me. "You okay?" she asked. "Yes," I said. Third lie. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. The following weekend, my mother mentioned a short trip, just 2 days, visiting a friend. She seemed hesitant about leaving him alone, concerned he might overdo it with projects or forget to eat properly. My wife reassured her immediately. "He'll be fine," she said quickly. "We'll check in." Oui. That night, I told my wife I'd be working late the next evening. She didn't question it. She just nodded and made a mental adjustment I could almost see happening behind her eyes. The next evening, I left the house at the usual time. Then I came back. I parked down the street and walked the rest of the way, heart pounding, not with fear, but with the strange certainty that comes when you know exactly what you're about to see. The house lights were on, one upstairs, our bedroom. I stood in the hallway again, just like the first night, but this time I didn't freeze. I heard voices, not whispered, not rushed, comfortable. His voice, her voice, saying each other's names without urgency, without caution, like this space belonged to them now. I pushed the door open. They didn't scream. They didn't jump apart. My wife turned first. Her face drained of color so fast it felt like watching something empty itself. He froze mid-sentence, one hand resting on the edge of the bed like he'd forgotten what it was for. For a moment, no one spoke. I looked at him, not with anger, with something closer to disbelief. "You knew," I said. He swallowed. You knew exactly what this would do," I continued, my voice steady enough to surprise all of us. "And you did it anyway." My wife started crying immediately, quietly, hands over her mouth. He didn't move. "How long?" I asked. She shook her head, then nodded, then whispered a number that felt unreal when it landed in the room, long enough to erase any version of this where it was a mistake. I laughed once, a short, humorless sound. "This ends now," I said, not as a threat, as a statement. He stood up slowly, eyes down. "I'll go." "Not yet," I replied. "You're going to leave, and you're never going to speak to my wife again, and you're going to decide how you explain yourself to my mother, because I won't do it for you." He looked at me then, really looked, and for the first time, I saw fear. He left a few minutes later without another word. My wife collapsed onto the bed, sobbing. I stood there, watching a marriage dissolve without shouting, without violence, without anything dramatic enough to make it feel deserved. "What happens now?" she asked, barely audible. I took a breath. "I don't know yet," I said, "but I know what doesn't happen." I walked out of the room and slept on the couch that night, staring at the ceiling until morning, understanding something with painful clarity. This wasn't just about betrayal. It was about the moment you realize the people closest to you are capable of building an entirely separate life inside yours and trusting you not to notice. And the hardest part wasn't what I'd seen. It was knowing that tomorrow I would have to decide how much truth my family could survive. Telling my mother was harder than catching them. That truth surprised me. I'd spent days bracing for confrontation, imagining raised voices, slammed doors, a dramatic reckoning that would somehow make sense of what I'd walked in on. But when the time came to speak to her, none of that mattered. All that mattered was the look on her face. When the ground shifted under her feet, I waited 2 days. Not because I was unsure, but because I needed to choose how the truth would arrive. I wasn't going to let it spill out in anger or arrive secondhand through excuses and half stories. If my family was going to break, it was going to break cleanly. I asked her to come over alone. She sounded surprised, but pleased, the way she always did when she thought she was being included. She brought pastries. She commented on the weather. She smiled at my wife when she arrived, completely unaware that my wife couldn't meet her eyes. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where we'd celebrated birthdays, holidays, milestones. I noticed how ordinary everything looked, how betrayal doesn't change furniture or lighting or routine. It just poisons it quietly. "There's something I need to tell you," I said. My mother's smile faded. She looked from me to my wife and back again. "Okay." I didn't look at my wife when I spoke. I kept my eyes on my mother because she deserved that much. "He's been having an affair," I said carefully, "with her." For a second, she didn't react. Not denial, not anger, just confusion, like I'd spoken in a language she didn't recognize. "With my partner?" she asked slowly. "Yes." The silence that followed felt endless. My mother laughed once, a short disbelieving sound, and then shook her head. "That's not funny." "I know," I said. "I wouldn't joke about this." She looked at my wife then, really looked at her, searching for something that could undo the words she'd just heard. My wife started crying immediately, nodding before my mother even asked. "Oh," my mother whispered. Her hands began to shake. She stood up so abruptly the chair scraped against the floor. "How long?" I didn't answer. My wife did. Quietly. Too quietly. The number hit the room and shattered whatever fragile hope my mother had been holding on to. She didn't scream. She sat back down, slowly, like her body had forgotten how to stand. She stared at the tabletop, lips parted, eyes glassy. "He told me he was helping," she said faintly. "He said he was running errands, fixing things. He said..." Her voice broke completely then. I reached for her hand. She didn't pull away, but she didn't hold on either. She just let it rest there, limp, like she didn't know what it was for anymore. She didn't look at my wife again. "I need you to leave," she said, her voice suddenly flat. My wife stood up immediately, whispering apologies that sounded meaningless even to her own ears. She walked past us without another word and went upstairs, leaving the two of us alone in the wreckage. My mother sat there for a long time without speaking. Finally, she said, "I don't know how to be in this family right now." I didn't argue. I didn't reassure her with empty promises. I understood that some wounds don't need comfort. They need space. She left shortly after. That night, my wife tried to talk. She stood in the doorway of the bedroom, eyes red, posture small, like she was trying to make herself take up less space in a house she'd already damaged beyond repair. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said. "I just need to understand what happens now." I looked at her for a long time. "We separate," I said finally. "Not because I want revenge, because I can't live in a place where trust has been dismantled this thoroughly." She nodded, tears spilling again. "And your mother?" "That's not something I get to manage," I replied. "You took something from her that I can't give back." She didn't argue. The days that followed were strangely quiet. No shouting. No accusations. Just logistics. Spare rooms. Schedules. The careful division of a life that had once felt indivisible. My mother didn't call. I didn't blame her. What haunted me wasn't just what my wife had done. It was how easily the truth had lived inside our lives without revealing itself. How familiarity had acted as camouflage. How trust had been used as cover. One evening, as I lay awake on the couch, staring at the ceiling, my wife asked the question she'd been circling for days. Do you hate me? I considered it carefully. No, I said. But I don't recognize us anymore. That seemed to land harder than anger would have, because hate still implies connection. And what we had left was distance, deliberate, necessary, and permanent. As I drifted toward sleep, one thought kept returning, heavy and unavoidable. The betrayal hadn't just broken my marriage. It had broken the illusion that family protects you from certain kinds of harm. And the hardest choice was still ahead, deciding what kind of man I would be once the truth was no longer hidden. The house felt different once my mother stopped coming by. Not emptier, quieter in a way that carried weight. Like a room after someone has said something you can't take back. My wife moved through it carefully during those last days, as if sound itself might accuse her. She packed a few things, slept in the guest room, avoided the spaces where memories gathered too thickly. I let it happen without commentary. Anger had burned off already. What was left was resolve. We agreed on a separation without lawyers, without theatrics. Logistics replaced emotion, schedules, finances, who would take which boxes. It felt sterile, almost merciful, like we were both afraid of what would happen if we let ourselves feel everything at once. The kids sensed the shift, even if they didn't understand it. They asked fewer questions than I expected. Children adapt quickly when adults refuse to turn pain into spectacle. I promised myself they would not inherit our mess any more than they already had. A week later, my mother finally called. Her voice sounded older, thinner, like she'd been holding herself together with effort rather than habit. I need to see you, she said. I drove to her house alone. He wasn't there. That absence spoke louder than anything else. She didn't offer coffee, didn't make small talk. She sat across from me at the same table where we'd eaten together so many times, and folded her hands like she was bracing for news she already knew. I asked him to leave, she said quietly. I nodded. I hadn't doubted it. He tried to explain, she continued. He said it wasn't what it looked like. He said he was confused, lonely. He said your wife needed someone. Her mouth tightened. I realized then that every word he said was about him. She looked at me, eyes wet but steady. I believed him for a long time, because believing him meant my life still made sense. I didn't interrupt. I don't know how to forgive myself for not seeing this, she said. For bringing him into your life, into your home. This wasn't your failure, I replied gently. It was his, and hers. She nodded slowly, like she needed to hear it said out loud. We sat there in silence for a while, the kind that doesn't demand filling. Then she surprised me. I don't want you to carry this for me, she said. I don't want you to protect me from the truth. I need to live with what happened. Fully. I studied her face and realized something unexpected. She wasn't asking for comfort. She was choosing clarity. That night when I got home, my wife was waiting. She looked smaller somehow. Not physically, like someone who'd finally run out of ways to justify what she'd done. She asked him to leave, my wife said quietly. Your mother. I know, I replied. Tears welled, but she didn't cry. I didn't think it would end like this. I held her gaze. How did you think it would end? She didn't answer. Instead, she asked something like I didn't expect. Are you going to hate me forever? I considered it carefully. No, I said. But I won't forget who I had to become to survive this. She nodded, accepting it. Maybe for the first time, she understood that forgiveness and access are not the same thing. She moved out 2 days later. Time passed in a way that felt unfamiliar, but steady. The house found a new rhythm. The kids adjusted. My mother began rebuilding her days without him, one routine at a time. We spoke often, not about him, not about my wife, but about ordinary things. Weather, groceries, the slow process of trust reforming in smaller, safer ways. And then came the part I never expected. About 3 months later, I received a letter, handwritten, from him. I stared at the envelope for a long time before opening it. debating whether to throw it away unopened. Curiosity won, not because I wanted answers, but because I wanted to know what kind of man writes after everything is already destroyed. The letter was long, careful, apologetic in the way people are when they want absolution without consequence. He talked about confusion, about mistakes, about loving my mother and caring deeply for my wife, about how things spiraled. There was one line that stopped me cold. I hope one day you'll understand that this wasn't meant to hurt anyone. I folded the letter slowly and set it aside. That night, I drove to my mother's house and handed it to her without comment. She read it silently. Then she tore it in half. Once, twice, again. I don't need his version of events, she said simply. Neither did I. The unexpected ending didn't come with closure or redemption. It came with something quieter. One evening, months later, my mother invited the kids and me over for dinner. Just us. No history attached, no replacements, no explanations. We ate. We laughed. The house felt lighter. As I watched my children talk to their grandmother, I realized something that finally settled the ache I'd been carrying. The betrayal didn't end my family. It ended a lie we'd all been living inside. And in its place, slowly, imperfectly, we were building something smaller but real. I didn't win. I didn't forgive everything. I didn't get the ending people expect. What I got was clarity. And sometimes that's the only kind of peace that lasts.